well, I remember hearing, I didn't really talk about paranormal with him, but I remember him talking about stories with my grandma and stuff like that. But I never told him until years later. I actually had written this story out, and had it. Somebody had read it on, on a podcast, and I let him listen to it. And I said, "Do you know where that was?" And he's like, "Absolutely." He said that was on Michael's Hill. So he knew something went on, and he knew whether he experienced something or not. I'm not sure, but he knew from what I was saying, what happened. He knew where it was at.
Interesting. Now, how has that affected you all your life? Or have you? It took me a long time, growing up to not be scared of the dark after that. I mean, till this day, but don't tell anybody, Les, but I am scared at night. If I'm watching TV and I drop the remote and it happens to fall a little bit underneath the bed, I'm kind of leery about, I have to turn a light on to grab the remote. That's just me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you definitely, like you said, you think about, if I do reach over the bed, is there something there, from stuff like that? Because it's kind of a stress, or it's burnt in your memory. I mean, I remember it like it was yesterday. It is stuck with me the entire time. I actually still, to this day, probably once or twice a year, and, I'm 46, going on 46 now, once or twice a year, I'll have a recurring nightmare of that house and something chasing me through that house, and I'll wake up, I'll be sweating, and sometimes in tears, and we're back to sleep and it starts all over again. So it sticks with you. I mean, I understand where you're coming from.
Oh, yeah, it does. A lot of people don't realize that. And I remember telling my grandmother, a young kid, you sit there and say, "Hey, this thing is haunted." I remember her, Sally said to me, "What way is it haunted?" And I said, "I saw this shadow come out, and went around the whole room." Now, she looked really shocked when I said that, but, maybe she saw something like that. I would think she did, because in that time frame, people lived in those apartments like 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, that was pretty much their life, living in that place. It was like their home. And I know that she has seen things, but she naturally is going to not say that to a young kid. Yeah, well, there's strange things that it's coming. You never know who passed on in that room, or what have you, or what are these creatures. But I tell you, the next day I got a hold of my uncle. I said, "Hey, it's time for me to come over." "Well, you don't supposed to be over for another couple of weeks." "I want to come over today." That's it.
Ready for you to get out of there, I guess.
I was scared. I couldn't have spent another night in that room. I just couldn't.
I don't blame you. Like I said, we moved not too long after that happened, and I couldn't have been happier. It was definitely a terrifying moment for me as a child.
Yeah, Les, what do you think the shadow people are? I mean, you investigate all kinds of things. What do you think they are? Are they ghosts, spirits, evil? What do you think they could be?
I really don't think they're one and all the same. I think there might be different. They may be different entities depending on what we are. I mean, we have the shadow. The one that most people see is the Hat Man. It seems to be a phenomenon all across the world. Whether that's what they call a watcher or seeker, or what I saw, I have no clue. Like I said, I was watching the small ones walk across my room, and this one stood in the corner. Didn't have a hat, so it wasn't that one. It didn't have the red eyes like you hear some people say. But I don't know if they're, like I said, there's different descriptions. I mean, some of them may be a spiritual thing, a ghost spirit, or demonic thing. But some I've heard where they're not really threatened. You hear people talk about, they see them and not really threatened by it or scared, and they just roll over and go back to sleep. One theory is maybe, what some people are seeing, it's because of sleep paralysis, or maybe it's somebody, or maybe that person or is having an out-of-body experience, and what they're seeing is their actual energy, soul, whatever you would like to call it, coming back toward their body. As far as alien, I've heard people say alien. It's even as an investigator, I'm still left with questions more than any answers.
Yeah, but sometimes I wonder too. People say, well, I saw shadow people or the Hat Man or whatever you want to call it, right? But I didn't feel threatened, or they didn't do anything. But how about the people that pass on during the night? Maybe these entities, depending on the person, come around the room, and when it's ready, they take your final breath from you. I don't know.
That's very, that's a good possibility. They could be like, maybe some would call an angel of death, or maybe it's a minion of the angel of death. I've heard that of people that's been in despair or sickness, and seeing these things, and during their last times. It's hard to answer, really.
Oh, it is. Now I got to ask you a question. Black-eyed children. You've been getting any? Have you investigated that, or any reports of black-eyed children?
Oddly, no. There's really none that I've had one person tell me about a black-eyed kid story. That's about it. It doesn't seem to be a big phenomenon here in West Virginia. I don't know why, or this is just people don't open up about it. We're kind of, the paranormal here, there's it's kind of underground still. There are people who talk about it, but it's more taboo. So it takes a little while to draw it out of some people around this area.
Yeah, I know that. How about like Mothman and stuff like that? Have you investigated Mothman or anything like that type of entity?
Recently, I got one call from a fella, and I've talked to him. It was in, I believe, 2012. He was driving home, and as he rounded the turn, he remembered he was driving a little S10 truck, and he remembered as he rounded the turn, looking at his clock, and if I remember the right time, I think it was 2:32, if I remember right, a.m., because he was coming home from work. And as he rounded the turn, his headlights hit something in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, and he said what he seen he could only describe as something that stood about 4 to 4.5, maybe 5 foot tall. He thought at first it had arms folded across its chest. It had almost like, he described, he said, the best thing I could describe it as is it had red eyes, like feline features in the face in a way. And then as he watched it, it unfolded wings. So what was across its chest wasn't arms, it was actually part of the wings. He said they were almost the entire width of the road, which was just a normal little 2-lane road here. He said then it flapped one time and shot straight in the air. And he said it felt like it only lasted like a few seconds, like 30 seconds. He said, but it didn't. It lasted several minutes. And I asked him what he meant by that. He said, I remember after it took off, I looked at the clock in my truck again, and it said 2:44. So 12 minutes passed while he sat there in his truck and stared at this thing. And that's the most recent one I've had. The other one, I talked to a gentleman, which has sadly passed away now. It's probably been 3 or 4 years ago. He started telling me a story that his brother, they lived in this little town and kind of a small house, and had a creek behind the house, and had a hillside that went up to a ridge line, and they had a pony that they kept in the backyard. But this is like years and years ago, and this is like he was like 13 or 14 years old, and he's passed away now. He was 72 years old. But he talked about they would hear this pony start just making all kind of noise. He said it was just bay, and it run around the backyard. So they started wondering what was going on, thinking there was a bear out, and it would come around at nighttime and harassing the pony and stuff. So they started looking around, him and his brother, and they noticed like drag marks. He said it was like a single drag mark, like something had a chain attached to it, or dragging a chain. And they noticed three-toed tracks. Like he said long, odd-shaped footprints that had three-toed tracks on it. And they went to their neighbor and talked to their neighbor, said, "Hey, have you had any trouble with anybody coming around your house?" And he's like, "No." He said, "Well, have you had anything missing?" He's like, "No." He said, "Well, so this guy's telling me that him and his brother asked him, have you had a chain come up missing?" He said, "I don't believe so." So he looked around his building. He said, "No, I have no chains missing." Then they talked to a couple other neighbors, and they said that the other neighbors said they had a couple animals that had come up missing. There was like a couple chickens and a pig or something like that, if I remember right. So they decided, and his brother was a few years older. He was like 16 or 17 years old. So they decided that they're going to wait and see what happens that night. And lo and behold, the pony started, making a noise. So his brother grabbed his gun. His brother had a 12-gauge shotgun, which he hunted with, hunted squirrel and stuff with. And the other fella had, he said, a small flashlight he won at the local fair. And he said it was one of the little silver ones that you had the little push button. He said, "I remember plain as day, that little flashlight." They started out, and then as they started out, their sister wanted to come with them. And they tried to talk her out of it, and she insisted that she went with them. So they started out and went across the creek and started up that bank behind the house, and they started hearing something coming down through the woods toward them. And he said, "I remember looking up." He said this thing was about 7 feet tall. He said it was a gray in color, had bright red eyes. He said between 8 and 10 inches apart. And he said as big as round as, he described them as bicycle reflectors, or reflectors you would see to mark a driveway. There's round reflectors. And as he looked at it, he yelled at his brother. He said, "Shoot it, shoot it." And when he turned and looked, his brother had already taken off running. And what he said was the weird part. He said it didn't really walk. He said, "I don't remember seeing a neck." He said there was no neck. It sat directly on his shoulders, and it waddled as it come down the hill. And that's when he told his brother, he said, "Shoot it." Well, his brother turned around, took off running, dropped the gun. And when he went to run, he noticed his sister had fainted and passed out. So he picked her up and drug her down off the hill and into the house. And I asked him, I said, "Have you ever," at first I'm thinking he's talking or describing a Bigfoot type thing. And then he started telling me a few other things. And it kind of lined up with some of the older sightings you see or you hear about with the Mothman, the gray collar, the waddling stuck out to me. The no neck, the wide head on the top of the shoulders. And I said, "Have you ever heard of Mothman?" He's like, "No." He said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." So if that was what he saw, I'm not sure, but to me, it may have been. But what surprised me is that was, Mothman was 66 to 67. This was in 63 or 64. So I don't know if he had one of the first sightings of Mothman or what it was.
It sounds interesting to me because, Mothman, started out in, a different part of the country. I know we're on the West Coast, and we're getting even sightings like in Oregon of a Mothman here several weeks ago. A friend of mine in Blanco, Texas, there's been sightings of Mothman there, where a lady actually was driving late at night and supposedly hit one. And she thought she hit a human, and she opened up the car door and got out and said, "Are you okay?" And that's when she noticed it had wings, and it stared at her with the red eyes and then took off. Hey, Les, we're going to have to go for break. We'll be back in about 4 minutes. So if you want to get a cup of java or whatever, we'll be back after the break. So stay tuned.